Hi, hello to all. I'm Max Marquardt, and I'm the founder and managing director of the Purdue Undergraduate Center for Innovation and Policy Research. And right now, I'm a current student double majoring in industrial management and economics. It is my pleasure to introduce the Honorable Robert Wark. Mr. Wark served as the 32nd Deputy Secretary of Defense, serving for 3 Secretaries of Defense from May 2014 through July 2017. Secretary Wark is now Senior Counselor for Defense CNAS, Senior Counselor at Telemus Group LLC, Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the MITRE Corporation, Senior Fellow at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, and Principal at WestExec Advisors. He is on 5 board of directors, including the Raytheon Corporation, and on the board of advisors of several small technology firms. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Robert Wark.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm a little intimidated following this morning's briefers, so I'll try to keep it rolling. Now, I no longer work for the Department of Defense, as Max said, but I want to start by saying unequivocally and unabashedly that the Armed Forces of the United States will undoubtedly embed more and more advanced autonomous functionality into its planning, combat, and weapon systems. Let me tell you why, and let me tell you why the Department of Defense thinks that is a good thing. Since World War II, the United States has counted on having a decisive edge in the military technical balance, help offset the numerical advantages in conventional forces that many of our competitors have always enjoyed. Now, this preference grew out of experience fighting the Axis in World War II. Dwight Eisenhower said this right after the war. While some of our allies were compelled to throw up a wall of flesh and blood as their chief defense against the aggressor's onslaught, we were able to use machines and technology to save lives. Hold that thought. Now, we are starting to shift away from, after 17 years, of a focus on irregular warfare and counterterrorism, and we're starting to think about deterring a great power war. We haven't had a great power war in over 70 years. That is the #1 requirement of the Department of Defense. And the best way to prevent a great power war is to be prepared to win one, if God forbid it happens. Now, a military technical advantage can contribute to a comfortable conventional military overmatch. And the stronger the perceived overmatch, the better your conventional deterrence. If a competitor believes that there is no way that they can win a conventional fight, then it is more likely that they will not turn to that option. And this is very, very important when confronting nuclear-armed great powers like Russia and China, where a weakened conventional deterrent could prompt more aggressive strategic probing that might lead to an overt military confrontation with the attendant risk of nuclear escalation. Now, up through World War II, perhaps the most popular way to pursue a conventional overmatch was to build a much bigger military than your competitor. This approach was the embodiment of the old adage, quantity has a quality all of its own. And it was one most enthusiastically embraced by the Soviet Union. It had been ingrained in their military culture over a long period of time, but enforced vividly in World War II against the Wehrmacht. But President Eisenhower, in the early part of the Cold War, simply refused to play the Soviet game. He did not want to pay the economic penalty for building up the 93 divisions that the military planners said would be required to deter a Soviet conventional invasion of Europe. So rather than matching the Soviets' man for man, tank for tank, ship for ship, plane for plane. He relied on his World War II experience, as well as the U.S. nuclear monopoly at the time, to confront their conventional numerical superiority with a much smaller force, but a force that was armed with atomic artillery rounds, rockets, and missiles and bombs. In other words, he was going to rely on battlefield atomic weapons to deter a conventional attack. And this was the United States' first Cold War offset strategy. Now, by the early 70s, the deterrent effect of the first offset strategy was starting to approach its sell-by date. There were two reasons for this. One, by this time, the Soviet Union had achieved strategic nuclear parity. And so the threat of early use of tactical nuclear weapons just didn't hunt. There was just no way that the United States could credibly threaten that, given the attendant risk of nuclear escalation. Second, during the 1960s and 1970s, while we were tied down in Vietnam, this is very, very akin to the problem we face right now. We were facing a different type of war. We come out of Vietnam. The Soviet Union has completely modernized all of its conventional forces, new tanks, new artillery pieces, new fighting vehicles, new airplanes, and they were all generally about the same level of quality as all of NATO's. And so this was a big problem for us. And not only that, but what they planned to do is attack NATO on a very narrow front. They knew what the first offset strategy was all about. Going to go to nuclear weapons, if necessary, to deter you and defeat you. But they said, look, if we stack our forces in echelons and we just do these relentless rolling attacks along narrow fronts, we'll break through and we'll punch an armored force deep into NATO's rear. And while all the NATO leaders are starting to argue about whether they should employ nuclear weapons, it would be too late. The Soviet forces would be deep in NATO's rear, and there was no way that NATO forces were going to start dropping bombs on the soil of their own territory. So this was a big, big problem for the United States to contend with. Now, for a very short period of time, we started to toy with the idea of what was then called active defense. We were going to stack our forces right in front of the attack, and we were going to use short-range anti-tank guided missiles and artillery pieces, artillery rounds, to blunt the attack. But it soon became evident through war games, through all sorts of analysis, that simply wouldn't work. We'd get crushed. Not only that, but the U.S. Army literally rebelled. They said, this is a dumb way to fight a war. We want to put more maneuver into the equation. So what happened was, they started to think about attacking the Soviet forces before they could even get to the front line. And they were going to do this by saying they were going to look deep and shoot deep. Now, looking deep and shooting deep sounds pretty easy right now that we're in the digital age and we've seen what guided munitions and everything can do. But back then, believe me, it was a big technical stretch. First, the Allies had to develop the means to look very, very deep, up to 200 miles beyond NATO front lines, and say where were the Soviet forces massing and what were their approach marches. And the way they did this was by assembling what we would call today battle networks. These were constructs with 4 stacked grids, a sensor grid that could look deep, kind of see what was happening in the battle space, a command, control, communications, and computer and intelligence grid that would make sense of what was being seen, decide what actions had to be taken, developing courses of action, selecting them, promulgating decisions. That was the C4I grid's responsibility. The effects grid was the way that commanders would apply force on the battlefield for the objectives that the commander had set. And they would do this by both non-kinetic and kinetic means, electronic warfare, and then kinetic attack. There was a 4th grid called the sustainment and regeneration grid. You just had to sustain your forces in combat, and you had to regenerate combat losses. So this was a big, big idea. The first battle network was actually the British Air Defense Network of World War II, the first modern battle network. But this was on a much grander scale at the campaign level. So even if they could shoot deep and they could target Soviet forces in real time, okay, we got tanks right here and we've got to hit them. The problem was almost all of the kinetic effectors in the force at the time were unguided munitions. And the key characteristic of unguided munitions warfare is that most of the projectiles that are shot, thrown, propelled, or dropped miss their targets. And as the range increases, the target miss increases wildly. In unguided munitions warfare, collateral damage was a way of life. In 1944, the circular error probable, which means, I'll tell you what this means in just a second, circular error probable of bombs being dropped from 20,000 feet over Germany was 3,300 feet. Now what the CEP is a statistical measure. 50% of all the bombs you drop fall within a circle with the radius of the CEP. So, you drop 1,000 bombs on Schweinfurt. 500 will fall within a circle around the factory that's 6,600 feet in diameter, well over 1.25 miles. So statistically, it was just as likely that you would hit a non-combatant sitting in their basement trying to ride out the attack as you were going to hit the factory itself. So if we were going to strike deep, you had to go after what was then called conventional weapons with near zero miss, what we call guided munitions. And many of them were two-stage weapons. They were either an artillery round, which was a cargo round. It would drop things out of its base, or a missile that could carry payloads, or an airplane that could carry bombs. And they would be shot or flown to a specific point in space, told to them by the battle network, and they'd drop these submunitions. The commander would say, tanks are over here. I don't care what tank you hit. Any tank you hit is a good thing. The submunition would make the final decision on which tank would die and which humans in the tank would be incinerated. Now, as far as I know, I've gone back and I have looked and looked and looked. I can't find a single article saying that this was an ethical or moral dilemma, that the final decision on which tank would die was delegated to the submunition. And we have had those type weapons since 1980, and we've used them in combat. Hold that thought. Now, the combination of battle networks that could look deep and be able to fire weapons that could actually hit their targets was nothing short of a disaster for the Soviet Union. First, it convinced them, and this is what Norman Polmar said, quote, that their American rivals were scientific magicians. What they said they could do, they could do. Second, it was always said, and certainly the Soviets believed it, that God was on the side of the biggest battalions. But what the Americans proved was that Voltaire was on the right side. Voltaire said in his treatise, God is not on the side of the big battalions, but on the side of those who shoot best. Third, they completely negated the Soviet campaign design. By 1984, they concluded that if the United States could do this with its NATO allies, they would achieve the same effects as tactical nuclear weapons with conventional weapons. And they said, game over. We can't win. We can't break through. And finally, it convinced the Soviet Union that if they were going to compete with the United States, they'd have to compete in a high-tech competition, and we would crush them. So, as Harold Brown said, the U.S. is better at technology than we are at mass. Ike would agree with him. So would Voltaire. And so not only this helped win the Cold War, but it also provided us with an enormous conventional advantage for the 25 years after the Cold War ended. States that had the means to do so, said we're going to have to compete with the United States in this new warfighting regime with battle networks and guided munitions. And those that couldn't do it said we're going to have to do something to offset them. And one of the ways to do it was to pursue nuclear weapons, to deter a conventional attack. Both North Korea and Iran have tried to do that. But now, here it is, 20 years after Desert Storm, where we demonstrated this new way of warfare. Both Russia and China had built up their own battle networks. The Russians called them reconnaissance strike complexes. The Chinese called them operational systems. We call them what they're designed to do, anti-access area denial networks. They are designed to prevent us from getting access into a theater, and they're designed to prevent our operational freedom once we get there. We're a global superpower. Not being able to project power into theaters is a bad thing. So by 2010, we started to think about what do we have to do to restore some level of conventional advantage for the United States. So I come in as deputy secretary in 2014. I have a very keen sense of what is happening in the military technical advantage. And I started having a series of briefings. So my first several months were filled with just a whole bunch of briefings. One day a guy comes in and says, look, Mrs. Secretary, if you don't get cyber right, you are doomed. They'll get inside your systems, they'll shut them all off, you won't be able to see anything, none of your weapons will hit anything. And I'll say, man, that doesn't sound too good. So I went home and drank a lot. The next day I'd get another brief and they'd say, look, if you don't get quantum right, you're doomed. Man, quantum, they'll have all sorts of quantum sensors and they'll be able to do they'll be able to figure out everything's going on. They'll have quantum communications. They'll just beat you. And I'll say, man, that's bad. So I went home and drank some more. And then I had a briefing on 5G. By God, I even had one on Bitcoin. If you don't get Bitcoin right, they're going to be inside your supply chain and you're doomed. Man, it was very depressing. So I turned to the DSB, the Defense Science Board, asked their opinion. They said, look, there's only one thing that you have to do. And they said, we can't quantify this, but we believe that advances in artificial intelligence now mean that we've achieved a tipping point in the operational value and potential warfighting effectiveness of autonomous systems. Now, as they saw it, autonomy resulted from the delegation of a decision to an authorized entity, we read that within the battle network, to take action within specific boundaries. It could be a human being, it could be a machine. And in both cases, this delegated decision-making authority included the capability to independently develop courses of action and select among them to accomplish goals based on the human or machine's understanding of the world itself and the situation. In other words, the DSB was talking about what we would refer to as artificial narrow intelligence systems. Now, this is an important distinction because a narrow AI system restricts their autonomous functionality to a particular problem or domain, the implication that it's programmed to operate within a defined boundary and system, a defined knowledge base. As the Air Force explains in their policy on human-machine teaming, autonomous systems have a degree of self-government and self-directed behavior with a human's proxy for decision. This could manifest itself in autonomy at rest, planning systems like we talked about this morning, predictive maintenance systems, or autonomy in motion, robotics and unmanned systems. Now, we believed, once we heard this and talked about it, our definition of machine intelligence is this: the programmed ability of a machine to make a decision as well as or better than a human faster. We were never, ever expecting perfection in machines, nor did we think that we should. In 2015, for the first time, computers had a better score on searching through objects in videos and pictures than humans. Humans would score about a 95% accuracy rate. The machines scored about a 95.6% accuracy rate. As soon as it was good as a human analyst, the IC started going gangbusters into computer vision. Now, if we could achieve that goal, we thought we could make more rapid and relevant combat decisions, humans making decisions, not machines. Machines helping humans make decisions, make sense of high heterogeneous and/or volume of data, operate effectively during intermittent comms, conduct operations requiring high complexity or coordinated action, especially across diverse operating domains from space to undersea, reducing the danger of mission to human operators, and providing high persistence and endurance. That all sounded pretty good to us. So persuasive were these arguments that the exploitation of artificial intelligence to achieve improved levels of autonomy became the basis for what we call the third offset strategy. Man, naming anything in the Department of Defense, I think Paul said it best, it's really bad because everybody starts talking about it. But I knew I couldn't use the word transformation. I knew I couldn't use the word revolution in military affairs. Both of them would have caused a riot. So I talked with the people in the Cold War, guys really smart, Harold Brown, Bill Perry, Paul Kaminsky, and they said, we always thought of this as offsetting Soviet strength. That's why we referred to them as offset strategies. And I said, sounds pretty good to me. So the third offset strategy was a hypothesis. We assumed that if you started to steadily insert increasingly sophisticated, narrow AI intelligence systems into all four grids of the battle network, at some point you would have a battle network that operated fundamentally different than any of the other battle networks that had come before. And a hypothesis that would allow more rapid understanding of the operational environment, more rapid development of a common joint operational picture, so everyone in the force knows what the heck's happening, they all see the same picture, more rapid development of plans, more rapid force-wide appreciation of commanders' intent, and more rapid, more relevant decisions promulgated faster to unmanned, manned, and human-machine combat teams able to provide more discriminate effects across every operating domain. We thought this would lead to a new revolution in war. We even called it what we thought it would be, algorithmic warfare. Project Maven, which you've all heard about, its original title was the Algorithmic Warfare Cross-Functional Team, which everyone puked on and said, we can't say that. And somebody said, okay, let's call it Project Maven. We said, done. Now, we always thought the road to algorithmic warfare was both principled and ethical. In our minds, it was the next natural shift from guided munitions, from unguided munitions that were indiscriminate and caused untold collateral damage and death to non-combatants, to guided munitions that were much more discreet and discriminate. And now we were going to go to a next stage, which would lead to fewer blue-on-blue engagements, friendly fire, fewer blue-on-green engagements, U.S. versus Allied fratricide, less collateral damage, more discriminate battlefield effects, which would reduce the number of non-combatant casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure. And because we were going to substitute machines for men in the most dangerous missions, we also knew it was absolutely certain it would cause fewer casualties. So we were saying, man, what's wrong with this picture? But from the very beginning, smart guys, Paul Schure, people were saying, look, this is going to really unsettle a lot of people. A future in which machines were making decisions, possibly over life and death. So we really had to get to the level of trust. And we knew that trust was absolutely essential. If you read the original DSB report, it has an entire chapter on how important establishing trust is. So it's not like we're suddenly responding to everybody saying, hey, didn't you think about this? From the very beginning, DSB would say, this is all built on trust. It explains why DOD 3000.09, which was written by Paul Charest, told about the steps that were necessary so that we would get machines that did what we expected them to do. And, you know, the largest DARPA grant to date on AI is on explainable AI. So I want to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, the United States military thinks it is the most ethical military force in history. We think we have the objective data to prove it. We think this will make us even more ethical and principled. But it's going to decide you have to have, first you have to design these systems to be operated in a trustworthy fashion with respect to the missions for which it was designed. So we know that development, operational test, and evaluation is going to be critical. We have to prove to ourselves, our commanders, and for people who are a little unsettled by this, that we can design machines for a specific narrow purpose, and we can get the algorithms right, and we can trust that they will do the mission repeatedly and as we expect. The problem is with new machine learning, someone said this morning, sometimes they will come up with answers you're not really sure about. We're going to have to work that out. And we're working it through DARPA, through academia, all sorts of different ways. Second, we have to design so that humans or machines can straightforwardly determine whether, once it's been deployed, if it's operating like we thought it would be. Unlike driving cars, for example, where you can do 1,000,000 trillion miles in a synthetic environment, we don't have large data sets on complex warfighting interactions. So we will be surprised. We're going to have a tight feedback loop to identify. And I would say there's going to be a new type of lawyer and a new type of engineer that is looking for anomalies in systems and making recommendations to the commander. You have to pull that out until we can correct the algorithm or have a different way to approach the problem. And finally, and perhaps more germane to the discussion today, we will design these weapons, and here's the quote from DoD policy. Designed to allow commanders and operators to exercise appropriate levels of judgment over the use of armed force. Let me say that again. DoD policy is that these have to be designed to allow commanders and operators to exercise appropriate levels of judgment over the use of armed force. Nowhere in policy does it say we have to have a human in the loop all the time. There will be cases. There are munitions that we have been using since 1980 where a human either aims at a target, a specific target, or directs fire at a group of targets and lets the machine decide what is the final target to engage. That is not, in my view, a fully autonomous weapon. In fact, if you read our policy, we only define semi-autonomous and autonomous. And the campaign to stop killer robots were the ones who said fully autonomous. And the way I read the campaign is that that means the machine is an independent, self-targeting system. It doesn't take direction directly from the commander. The commander might say, my objective is to win the campaign. And then you release the fully autonomous weapon system into the wild. And the reason why I know that the Department of Defense will never, ever, ever go after a fully autonomous weapon system is because in our own policy, the person who is responsible if that weapon system screws up distinction or proportionality, is the commander that employed it. It is very, very clear. So, look, I'm here to tell you, I can't think of an operator in a Western army who would want a fully autonomous weapon system. Do they want more autonomous functionality in their weapons? Absolutely. But I just can't think of a US or a European commander saying, let me release this weapon in the wild and let it decide who and when to kill. Will the Chinese or the Russians decide to do that? I don't know. But certainly it won't be, the United States military will not be the first mover if that is the case. Man, these are difficult questions, as Paul said this morning and as our great first panel said. These are difficult moral and ethical questions. The Department of Defense wants to engage in this debate. We want to convince people that this is a righteous path, that it will ultimately lead to more discriminate operations on the battlefield and less loss of human life. So I don't know if I've convinced you or not, but I hope I've convinced you that the department is open to these debates. We want to have them. We want to engage in them. And hopefully everybody in this audience is going to help us get to the right answer that we all agree in the end is ethical, moral, and legal. Thank you. I think I have talked 10 minutes too long. So
we can have time for one or two questions.
All right, lay it on me. I'm ready. I'm in my autonomous mode.
I have a question for you. Thank you for this superb and thoughtful presentation. You are quoted in Paul Charet's book as speaking of autonomous underwater vessels and autonomous surface vessels operating in swarms, possibly chasing down enemy submarines. I work for the Arms Control Association. We worry that this might precipitate unease among adversaries, that their invulnerable second strike systems could be put at risk, therefore making early onset use of nuclear weapons. That is, this will create an escalatory process. Could you help explain this to me?
Well, first, I want to make a confession here publicly, because here I was as a deputy secretary. I am talking about autonomous weapons, and no one on my staff ever said, hey, you ought to read DOD 3000.09. I didn't even know it existed. So I would use terms like human in the loop. In my mind, I was saying the human would be the one who decides what targets to hit. The machine might prosecute the engagement. But if I had known about 3000.09, I give all credit to Paul, because the wording in that policy, I think, is right on. Some people call it meaningful human control, but Heather has written, look, it's pretty much the same. So in this point, if we did release that swarm, a human commander would say, we believe that the benefits outweigh the risks. In the Cold War, the whole idea of the maritime strategy was to push into what were then called the Soviet bastions and place their second strike capability at risk. And the judgment was that it would be de-escalatory. It would cause the Soviet Union to say, wow, this would not be good, because if it did get to a nuclear exchange, we wouldn't have our second strike. So it was actually judged as being de-escalatory, that it would deter the Soviets. But these are judgments that, it's hard to say. How would the Chinese react? How would Iran react if they had a ballistic missile? I don't think that the swarm changes it at all. You know, it's either an SSN, an attack submarine, going in to hunt down that vessel, or we say, hey, look, inside there, the defenses are so much, we're going to do an unmanned swarm. So this is a difficult problem. I leave it to people like Ron and the experts who think, you know, like Herman Kahn did and Alfred Wohlstetter. You know, they always made my head hurt on escalatory dynamics.
Time for one more question.
Yes, ma'am.
Paula Trimble, I always have questions. I was wondering if you could talk about the role of training and experimentation in sort of getting people comfortable and verifying and validating the autonomous technologies. I know we saw Sea Hunter earlier, but that's one of, and so maybe you could talk about the role of procuring more than one of.
Yeah, the U.S. Navy, I give them a lot of credit. Inside the program that they have right now, they're buying 237 different unmanned systems. 10 large unmanned surface vessels, much larger than the picture you saw of Sea Hunter. I think, 6 to 10 medium vessels, which are the Sea Hunter size. Really big unmanned underwater vessels, which are being viewed as potentially offensive mining capability, et cetera. The Navy doesn't know exactly how they would operate them with the fleet yet, so they're going to experiment with them. The U.S. Army, one of the most dangerous operations is a breach through an obstacle that is covered by fire. That is a very, very tough and dangerous mission. The U.S. Army just did a whole experiment on a robotic breach where you would send in robots first and let the robots get wiped out in the breach and then push humans through. So all of the services are experimenting. Now, someone said this morning, I can't remember who, but they were talking about a commander. And this is the way, I think I agreed with you. We want to train our commanders to use the machines to allow them to make better decisions, but we want the commander to make decisions. If all a commander does is do what the machine tells them, then go automate it. The Russians have already decided that's the way it's going to be. The reason why we know this is because their conception of a reconnaissance strike complex is a completely automated system where the machines make all the decisions. We think that's extraordinarily dangerous. That's why we call it human-machine collaboration. Machines to allow humans to make better decisions. And human-machine combat teaming, unmanned systems operating with humans. So, in my view, you're going to have, and this is possible, you're going to have battle school, and I call them Ender's Games. You're going to have to send commanders to the school, and you're going to have to put them in synthetic environments and see which commanders just don't slavishly follow what the machine tells them. Those guys might be good, I don't want to offend anybody in here, but they might be good logisticians. They aren't going to be a Patton. What you're looking for are commanders who use the machine to say, okay, this is the way I'm going to go. And we can actually define games like that in a synthetic environment and find out which commanders actually have free will and are not, slavishly devoted to machines. So this is the last thing I say because I know we're running out of time. The combustion engine was developed in 1886. It wasn't until 1914 that the British Imperial staff said, hey, we ought to have mechanization. 28 years. What was happening in that time frame? Well, this is what I think. My colleague, Mike Horowitz, up at the University of Pennsylvania, is actually studying this. This is what I think. The cavalry said, you don't want those stinky, smelly things. They break down. Horses you can take with them. You can feed them anywhere you go. Man, it's so much better to have a saber. Who wants to drive to war in a Jeep? You had an entire, somebody said this morning, yeah, it's right. Naval aviators don't want unmanned systems on the deck. because, man, they wouldn't be Top Guns anymore. You know, some unmanned system would be the Top Gun. That would really suck. So, you know, this is going to be a very long period of time. That's why I'm convinced we can get this right. We can have these debates on ethics and morals. Heck, the first guided munition, as Paul said, was dropped, was actually fired. It was a homing torpedo. It was fired in 1943. It wasn't until 1990 that we actually had the revolution that guided munition. These things happen over a long period of time. So this isn't something that, 5 years from now, we're going to have all these robots running around. We're going to have experimentation. We're going to have to figure out our doctrine. We're going to have to train our commanders. We're going to have to train our people. It's going to take a long time. And throughout all this time, we're going to have things like this, where people are saying, what about the ethical, what does this mean ethically on how we'll operate? You know, is it moral? Is it legal? Is it consistent with the laws of war? We can do this together. So with that, I want to compliment Purdue for setting up this awesome symposium. And I hope you all have a great rest of the afternoon.